Welcome again. It's Wednesday, April 29th, 2020. Welcome back to Council's Week. It's great to have several hundred of you live with us today via Zoom for this very special keynote session with Dean Cecilia Rouse, whom I will introduce in just a moment. But let me first share a personal note. Dean Rouse, she asked me to call her Cecilia, and I only recently met through a mutual friend. And at first, I must admit, I was quite intimidated. She is widely recognized as one of the top economists in the world. As I also quickly discovered, however, she is a remarkably decent and kind person, and even in our limited interactions has become a kind of mentor to me, even though she doesn't know it, on how to lead during this moment of radical uncertainty. She's the Dean of Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. She's also the Lawrence and Shirley Katzman and also Lewis and Anna Ernst Professor in the Economics of Education and the Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. I just want to share a number of these things so you know who we have with us today. She's also the founding director of the Princeton University Education Research Section and has served as editor of both the Journal of Labor Economics and currently senior editor of The Future of Children. And this is an important point because we'd like to talk a little bit about her point of view on how this might be impacting young people. Cecilia is also a member of the National Academy of Education, a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. She served a year in the White House at the National Economic Council in 1988 to 99, and then from 2009 to 2011 served as a member of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. So like right then at the heart of the Great Recession, which is like one of the things that's going to be so helpful to be able to talk to her today about the difference between then and now. She's also a board member of T. Rowe Price Fund. She's on the board of the National Bureau of Economic Research, Council on Foreign Relations, the Pennington School, and the Atlantic Economic Society, International Atlantic Economic Society. So she's going to talk for 20 or 30 minutes about a number of topics, including, as I mentioned, her point of view on the difference between the crisis we face today and the financial crisis in '08. The challenges of real-time decision-making, potential impact, as I mentioned, on both Gen Z and I guess what we're calling Gen A now, which is the younger people, and then how the coronavirus may affect, and this is of real personal interest to me, Africa and Latin America and why that matters to us here. While she's speaking, please post questions on chat or Q&A. You know, we'll get to that later in the call and I'll be monitoring that. And Cecilia, again, thanks so much for being with us here today and helping us think about this very difficult moment.
Well, thank you very much, Phil. And hello to everybody. I will confess, this is my first big Zoom talk, so forgive me if it's a little weird. I usually am standing up and I've been told, can I talk if I can't use my hands? I'm usually moving around quite a bit. So hopefully this will work via Zoom, but it's really a pleasure to be here and to share some of my thoughts. If I don't get to some of the points that Phil just promised that I would talk about, feel free to read them in the Q&A. But I thought I will start off with at least my perspective on the situation that we're in, where we're headed, and at least some of my hopes and as we come out of this. So first, just because I have 4 slides that I will show in a moment, but since I don't have slides, I thought I would organize by starting off with there are 5 things that I hope to talk about today. Okay. First is that this is not a typical downturn. This is a public health crisis for which we need to put the country into a medically induced coma, which caused the economic crisis. The second point is that our federal response has been, in my humble opinion, remarkably large and remarkably swift. Sometimes though, speed can come at the cost of efficiency. And so while the execution, I think, has been less than stellar and reveals cracks in our own public sector, I think we have to be relatively proud of our lawmakers for getting us this far. There's more to be done, which is one of my other points. Third is the longer it takes for us to get past the public health emergency, the bigger the toll on the economy. Yeah. As I will refer to later, Glenn Hubbard, who I was on a call with last week, who is the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors and a former dean at the Columbia Business School, his prediction is that our recovery will look like a Nike swoosh. And I thought that was a great analogy. And by that, he means that there has been a very quick shuttering, putting the economy into the coma. So that's the quick downturn on the swoosh. I guess I'm backwards. And then the recovery is not likely to be V-shaped. We already know that, partially because it is going to take some time to work through the pandemic. But it will slowly start to recover, and then it will pick up speed as we really get past the health crisis. The bones on the economy were good. This was not an economic crisis. And so again, that's part of the reason why the sooner we can get past the health crisis, the faster we can pick up, and the quicker we'll get back to where we had been.
And by
Third,
the way,
we will
one point on Glenn Hubbard. He was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for the first 2 year of Trump's term. Is that right?
I believe that's right. Well,
Yeah.
it was during Trump's term. I'm not sure which 2 years.
Yeah.
That may be.
Okay. Okay. All right. Keep going.
My fourth point is we will almost certainly need additional federal assistance. That's largely because if the private market's not operating, then the public sector needs to step in. State and local governments have balanced budget laws. The federal government is the right body to do so. People ask, can we afford it? I'll come back to this. We can't not afford it. Let's put it that way. And last, what I hope we learn from this crisis is, one, that the level of inequality and the cracks in our safety net are just unacceptably high. Lots of cracks, high levels of inequality. And I really hope that this pandemic lays bare the important role for government in certain situations, that while very important and vibrant private sector, and I believe in the private sector, there are known market failures, if you remember back from Economics 101, and those are the places where we need to have a strong, effective federal government. Okay, so those are my 5 points, so let's get to it. Okay, so one, I'm having a hard time believing it's only been about 7 weeks since we truly started responding to this crisis. Governor Newsom was the first governor to issue a stay-at-home order, and that was just March 19th. I'm in New Jersey, and our governor, Governor Murphy, had us stay home starting on March 21st, and it is now only April 29th. It seems like a lifetime, but really it has not been that long. And I remind us of that because the strides we've made, for example, in testing over these past 6-7 weeks have been remarkable. And that's the kind of infrastructure that we're going to need in order to reopen in a more strategic way going forward. And so I personally have faith that if you just look at the improvements over the past 6-7 weeks, that in another 6-7 weeks, which puts us into June, we may be much more strategic. And that's part of the reason why I think we will start to recover from this, because it will be possible to reopen if we can be more strategic in how we do so. So these governors put in place shutdown orders or stay-at-home orders, and that was on doctor's orders, shall we say? The impact was immediate. So so my first point, as I noted before, was that this is not a typical downturn. So I'm now going to dare in Zoom to share my screen. I have 4 slides. And so bear with me while I get this set up.
Sure.
Okay.
Great.
So my first slide is meant to illustrate that this is not like the financial crisis of 2008, and it's not like a typical financial crisis. So this slide is the number of initial unemployment insurance claims. These are not seasonally adjusted. Typically, if you're reading the newspaper or listening to news, the numbers that you will see will have been adjusted for seasonality. We know that in December, more people are hired and then they're laid off in January. Over the summer, students have employment and then they're unemployed. So typically we smooth out those seasonal adjustments so we can measure what is actually due to the health of the economy versus seasonality that we expect. However, given that we've got this really unusual economy, it's really unclear what the seasonal adjustments will be and how they'll do them. And so I just thought, let's just use the unadjusted numbers. What I did was I centered the x-axis on the week with the highest number of claims in 2008 and then here this spring. For both, that turned out to have been March 28th by chance, at least unadjusted seasonally claimed. So that's where we centered them. But the blue, and I apologize to those who are colorblind, but the lower bars, the blue ones are from 2008, 2009, and the green bars, the much larger ones, are from this spring. So the first thing you'll notice is that in 2008, 2009, we never reached the level of unemployment claims that we see here. What we did here was the governor said stay at home, and we did. The economy came to a halt, which threw many people out of work. And so that is, again, in a typical when there's a financial problem, such as in the financial sector, there was sort of a slow burn as different sectors were affected and more people were thrown out of work, and that gathered steam. This was not that case at all. So that's the reason I really want to highlight this is one is the federal response. I personally don't think it should be described as stimulus because we're not trying to stimulate the economy. What we're trying to say is, look, we have, I think people have calculated what, 22 million people who've claimed unemployment insurance or filed, and we get new numbers tomorrow on that number.
Yeah.
So we've had people are out of job and they're filing, and that's really important, but that's not like what we would see in a typical economic downturn. The second point is, and before this worked, okay, maybe it has to be there. Okay, bear with me.
You might try your down arrow if they're having trouble with the mouse. Oh, there you go.
There we go.
Okay.
So the second point is on Friday, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Department of Labor, will release unemployment figures from April. Already I'm hearing pundits talk about, well, those numbers are going to be eye-popping. We're expecting unemployment rates. I've heard 14%, 20%. And those are going to be large numbers. What's unusual here is that they're going to reflect what the BLS measures. And so they're not going to fully reveal the percentage of people who are out of work. This graph shows you using data from the Gallup panel. Gallup has been surveying a panel of workers since mid-March. They survey them on a rolling basis weekly, and it gives us a better sense in real time of what's going on. The BLS only releases unemployment figures once a month, and they can ask more probing questions. Here's the problem with the BLS number, is that it's based on a survey of individuals, of households really, but they go to an individual. And they ask them, oh, do you have a job? No. Or are you employed? No. Okay. And if you're not employed, then the question is, are you looking for work? And are you available for work? You know, when you have an economy that's been intentionally put into a medically induced coma, a pause, many workers are expecting to go back to their employers, or they hoping they are. They know there aren't jobs available. So why look for a job? They're meant to be staying home. So it's very unclear how workers will answer that question. In addition, the BLS figure includes people who are on temporary layoff as part of the unemployment rate. Many workers don't know whether they're not on a job temporarily or if the business will end up closing permanently. So it's very unclear to me how individuals will actually respond. So this is a comparison. The Gallup team at Gallup attempted to replicate the BLS estimate, and those are the first bars in blue. So you can see that in the week ending April 26th, they estimated, and I actually can't see my number here, that the unemployment rate as measured by BLS would be 7.2%, although BLS adds in the temporarily laid off, so that would add an unemployment rate of 14%. But Gallup also asked which of those workers are still at work but have reduced hours and may have reduced wages as a result, meaning that they have been adversely affected by this crisis. And you see that increases to 33% a couple of weeks ago and 31% most recently. So this just tells us that yes, the unemployment numbers are going to be eye-popping, but they're not going to fully really tell us the impact on the labor market. At the same time, as I was just saying, this is not a typical recession. So I personally don't even know how to interpret what these numbers mean. They tell me the percentage of our labor force that has been affected by this crisis, and that is tragic. At the same time, it is what our health experts told us we needed to do. In other countries, they have tried to help workers and businesses, not by kind of encouraging the separation between the worker and the firm, but by paying at least some portion of the payroll of the firm. And so the firm continues to pay the wages of the worker. So they're not seeing themselves as being separated from their employment. We chose to do it differently. So we're seeing it through unemployment and how we're looking at people who've been separated. In the end, time will tell, which is the better way to approach this, but I'm not sure that our high unemployment rate is going to tell us much about the recovery as we would expect in a typical recession. But this is by way of saying a large percentage of our labor force has been adversely impacted, and there's no question about that.
Yeah.
Did you want to say something, Phil?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's really helpful to just be reminded how the BLS works and the questions that and you can't really change that survey, right? Or that's a big job to change that survey. How does
So my understanding is they're attempting to, first of all, there are other measures of unemployment that the BLS uses. And they're attempting to probe a little bit more in order to understand what people are doing for unemployment. But at some level, as a statistician, we want to have a consistent definition of a certain measure of unemployment over time. Right. But at the same time, from understanding what is happening today, we might want more expansive. So I think they're trying to adjust, but it'll be unclear, because what I've also understood is they usually in the first wave, people are in for 4 months and then they're out and they're in for 4 months. Usually when they first approach them and do it in person, I think it's all online. So I just don't know how people will interpret these questions. We just don't know. It's
really helpful. And the small decline from April 13 to 19 to April 20 to 26, is that sort of within the margin of error, or does that telling us something, do you think?
Wait, which one?
So from 33.1 to 30 between the last, is that within the margin of error, or is there a little bit of green shoots happening there?
So it's within the margin of error. The problem is this includes people who are in the labor force. Undoubtedly, one of the factors that is happening as we go through this, and I just didn't pull up the numbers, is that people are withdrawing from the labor force altogether. So typically when it's in the labor force, if you have a job or you're actively looking for work. But again, if you're not actively looking for work because we're in a pandemic, are you counted as being out of the labor force, or are you still counted as being in the labor force?
And unemployed, right.
Nuances, I really don't know.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Great.
So we know that many people are being harmed. We know that businesses are being harmed. So what has been the response? So this is the infamous CARES Act, the Corona Aid Relief and Economic Security Act. This was actually the third tranche of effort that the federal government put forth, but it was by far the largest. And so this became law on March 27th. So again, the first stay-at-home orders were issued March 19th. This was pretty quick action on the part of the federal government for a package which is $2.2 trillion. So many of you are familiar with this already. It included aid to individuals, which was through expanded eligibility for unemployment insurance, extensions on unemployment insurance. It included loans to big corporations. It included a paycheck protection program for small businesses, and in addition, an emergency loan program for small businesses. It included some aid for state and local governments. I want to come back to the state and local governments. I want to highlight that this $340 billion was meant to be used for COVID-related relief. Part of the discussion challenge for the next bit of state and local relief is whether they can use those funds for other revenue challenges. And there's let's say, a philosophical difference of opinion there. Then there was $154 billion for public health and about $44 billion for education and other expenses. So this was a very large, expensive package. I believe that, in my humble opinion, I think that this hit the large components that we needed to be worried about, and it's massive. The challenge is that it was, one way I described it, is sort of put together through spit and duct tape, because we don't have a lot of systems that were ready-made for, say, doing cash transfers. So in the $560 billion for individuals, a good component of that was through our unemployment insurance system. Our unemployment insurance system was swamped. They are typically processing initial claims of 200,000 a week. Now they're getting millions in a week. The unemployment was at record low levels. Many times our unemployment insurance offices are staffed based on the unemployment level, which meant that they were low, their staffing levels were low even by historical standards. In addition to the fact that this broadened eligibility, so there have been a lot of confusion about who's eligible, who's not eligible. Many individuals are not applying for unemployment insurance. because they don't know that they're eligible, or even the people on the other end aren't sure whether they're eligible. In California, there was a lot of confusion because they'd been attempting to make gig workers actual workers, and then that started to confuse in terms of expanding the eligibility for contract workers. I think they have worked it out now, but all of that had to be worked out. This was just like a tsunami of funds being pushed through a system that was not designed for it. Similarly, we've discussed the Paycheck Protection Program. Many of you are even more familiar with it than I am. But Lending Tree has estimated that only about 6% of small businesses, 5% of small business owners have received any loan relief from that, whereas 60% have actually applied. So it's really been in the execution that I think we're going to see the headwinds for our recovery, but the intent was there. And just my final slide is, just this past week, President Trump signed into law the Paycheck Protection Program and Healthcare Enhancement Act. This was explicitly an interim act. So Congress knows it needs to do more, but it was meant to replenish the Paycheck Protection Program, give additional funding for hospitals and the public health care system, administrative costs to the SBA, paying wages and other administrative costs, which they desperately need, additional funding for testing as well.
Yeah.
So did you have a question?
Yeah, a question came through, which I think makes sense to ask now. So this is very, very helpful, by the way. And again, I really appreciate you laying this out clearly. I think many people have read some of these things, but being able to put it together. Do you feel, Paul asked, that our approach, relying on separation from employers rather than providing support to firms for, I'm just reading what he wrote here, for wages and avoiding separation, will increase the time to recovery? How do you think this approach will affect displacement or disconnection within the labor market?
So time will tell. And so we haven't quite run this experiment. I can guarantee you many people will be studying this. My own prediction is that our approach will slow the recovery. I heard one economist say they would always bet on the American economy because we have so much dynamism in our private sector. And I would bet on that on the long term as well. If you look at systems where they were more able to centrally pay for workers, a lot of them have labor markets that have more sclerosis in them. It's hard. There's many more protections for workers. It's hard to fire workers. It's hard to have that dynamism. However, in terms of recovering, we are inducing some separations. So if a worker says, I don't know if my job will be coming back or I can count on it, they might start looking, and even they may find another job, but that will take a little bit of time. Small businesses that are forced to close permanently, some of those entrepreneurs may well come up with another business, but that will take time even for that to start again. Right. So I suspect that this approach is going to prolong the length of the recovery or slow the recovery. At the same time, we went to war with the army we had. Yeah, and was there really a choice? There was no other way to do it, right? So there is a senator who has proposed us paying for the wages of workers directly. I suspect that would have even involved systems for us that we don't have, that for Treasury to set up that we don't already have. My understanding, Treasury is used to receiving money from companies, not used to giving money to companies. So in the 2008 financial crisis, I spent a lot of time actually working up and trying to expand our short-time employment, which Germany used, which is a form of work sharing. And so the Germans got through without having the same displacement we had in 2008 because they just reduced the hours of workers. We have the capability for states to do that, and many states actually have such programs, but again, it's through our unemployment insurance system. So it's not independent of that system as well. Okay, good. We got more questions coming in. This is from Savannah in Colorado, who runs a inner city youth program, actually. It's a great program called Minds That Matter. He said, you mentioned that the bones of the economy were good. And he said, I've been concerned that the economy had been overheating for some time with loose monetary policy, low interest rates, a strong dollar, large federal debts, long expansion. I thought a large contraction was coming anyways, and COVID-19 lit the match. Do you have a different perspective, and how does that affect your perceptions of the depth of the recession and also potential inflation, which people are beginning to wonder about? Yeah, so I'm not a macroeconomist, so I'm not going to prognosis. I'm not going to try to give a forecast about inflation. And I think that will depend ultimately on the monetary policy. So there's my own humble opinion is we had the longest running recovery, if not in this century. You know, it was a rather long in the tooth recovery, and I think many were expecting a correction, but we would have expected a correction to come within the economic system, and it wouldn't have come nearly this fast, nearly this comprehensively. And we would have understood better what we were trying to do in order to address it. So we would have been using economic tools to battle what was an economic problem. Right. This stemmed from the public health concern. So while I agree that there may have been a correction coming, especially in the stock market, I don't think it would have been nearly as severe, nearly as deep. And it might have taken us longer to recover from it. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. This is maybe a little more of a macro question, but let me ask it. What do you think the longer term impact will be of all this budget spending versus other budget areas that were long-term priorities for the government?
So I'm not sure what that, so, you know, the federal government is not doesn't have a household balance sheet in the same, you know, it's not a household balance sheet. Yeah. Paul Krugman would say we can run a debt indefinitely because it's really borrowing from future generations, and households don't necessarily have an infinite number of generations. We hope our country will. You know, right now we have a public health crisis. The private sector can't step in. We don't want to stimulate any part of the economy at the moment. Now we're starting to wake up. But even there, we're going to have to do that in a way that's going to be costly and will not mean that we can just start going to a full sprint. So right now, we want to protect individuals. We want to protect as many businesses as we can. And so that's going to require the help of the federal government. There will be a reckoning, but there is time for there to be a reckoning. And it doesn't have to be a severe reckoning, but there will have to be prioritization. And I do expect that there's going to be parts of our economy that are more damaged than others. Yeah. And so there may be a time there will be a time, I'm not sure when, we will want to turn to more traditional stimulus. So this is, people are starting to talk about an infrastructure bill. You know, unemployment, interest rates are at historically low levels. This is a great time for our federal government to get its house in order. You know, so I'm not sure what some of the other priorities were. I think infrastructure has been a priority. Yeah. I think our public health system has clearly meant to be a priority, and other parts of our safety net. So
yeah, great. No more questions, and I just want to remind folks, keep asking questions. This is great. One of our longtime members, he runs a successful online retail business that's kind of been able to manage through. It's been hard. They had to shut down some of their offices and warehouses, but he says, given the decrease in travel, restaurant, and entertainment spending, do you expect the secular trend of increased spending on services and a deceleration in goods to reverse for at least the balance of the year?
Okay, wait, can you just say the directions again?
Sure. We've had increasingly a service economy, right, with the decline in manufacturing, but service has been the hardest hit in this moment. Yes. And then we saw that in today's GDP number. So he's asking, do you think that will continue essentially?
I suspect we're going to get back to get back on that track. I don't see us rushing back into factories. I don't see us rushing back onto the farms. I think we are largely a service economy. It may be slower. So if we think about how the economy is going to come back, firms that are opening are going to have to figure out how to physically distance until we have herd immunity or a vaccine. And that's going to be costly. So if you think about the restaurant industry, yes, you can put tables, you can put some sort of protective barrier around tables. There's going to be fewer customers. You may need fewer people working. So that's costly. And it means employment isn't quite as high as it would have been otherwise. So I think that it will be slower to come back, but I still think we're largely going to be a service economy.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. What else do we have here?
Can I make one note about the manufacturing?
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think one aspect of the globalization that this pandemic has highlighted, is that in some sectors, we are really reliant on like one supply chain, and that we're going to need to find ways to diversify how we do our business.
Yeah.
It may mean that it's not quite as bone efficient as it was before,
Right.
but I think this pandemic is highlighting that we need to have some resiliency, some redundancy built in, even if it sort of, maybe lowers profits for the owners a little bit, but smooths things. You don't have quite the volatility as well. So that may bring back some manufacturing to the US or to at least other parts of the world. So that might redistribute some of that.
Yeah. We're on Friday, as I mentioned to you, we have our annual Berkshire workshop and then the Berkshire meetings on Saturday. And one of the things I'm going to share with people on Friday in my talk is, if you, over the last 40 years, Buffett almost every year has said some version of, we're ready for a 1,000-year flood. Like, in fact, in the February 22 letter, he literally used that language, we're ready if there's a 1,000-year flood. And most other companies have not really approached their business in that regard. Now he has said, we have reserves for reserves. They don't use a lot of debt. They look at resiliency as an emphasis, but that's not been the case for most companies in the last 30 years. Yeah.
Right.
So,
I would.
Yeah, go ahead.
This can be true on the worker side as well. I think that we have been trying to be so efficient with our workforces. Firms have, because of I'm going to say crazy way that we provide health insurance in this country, largely tying it to employment, that has made it very costly for employers to have workers, especially full-time workers. And so it becomes more cost efficient to outsource them and hire them back as contract workers. But it means that those workers now don't have the safety net protections that they need. And so I think we're going to have a reckoning on that side too, which is that workers are going to need decent wages. They need decent safety net, healthcare, sick pay, disability, and things like that. So I feel that we can't be writing quite as lean, quite as efficient as my profession has emphasized, building a little bit more cushion for everybody, because we all.
That's a great point. Someone asked me, it was like 3 weeks ago, and I didn't have any particular insight, but they said, why did Sephora Canada not lay off people and Sephora US lay off people? And I said, look, I don't have insight into that particular company, but I will tell you that if you're an employer in Canada, you have 20% less costs right off the bat, because you don't have not just health insurance and the additional costs that come along with that. And so that's a huge budget issue, as a single employer. And I don't want to necessarily jump into the healthcare debate, but from a business point of view, and it's funny because my dad sold corporate health insurance. That's, starting in the early 60s when it was like really becoming a thing for American companies as a competitive advantage for recruiting workers. So, I get it, but it would, if we could wave a wand, I would prefer to not be the company for my employees. I don't want to be their healthcare source.
My colleagues Ann Case and Angus Deaton have a new book called Deaths of Despair, The Future of Capitalism, American Capitalism, I believe it is. And they very starkly make this point. They're talking about the opioid crisis, but their main point is really, we do healthcare so expensively, so inefficiently, and tying into employment has meant that workers are without a job and their wages have been stagnant because from a firm's point of view, the healthcare is part of the cost of compensation. Right. So if instead it was more, I don't want to say centralized, but if it was paid for by, say, the government, then the firm would have to pay higher wages and people could get their healthcare from the government and have wages to do other things with. So I'm putting a plug for their book.
Okay, excellent. I'll take a look at that. And so colleges, let's talk about that for a moment. And there's actually a question from a student who's graduating right now from college, but you're at Princeton. Harvard announced yesterday that they may go online for classes. We had a discussion yesterday with Dan Ariely about, we were talking both about efficiency and resiliency, like you're saying, but also talking about could colleges set up kind of dorm faculty centers where, you take 50 students and 10 faculty and put them in that for a semester, whatever. Who knows? I love that idea. I don't know how operationally you could make that happen. As a student, I would love that. But what are you thinking about at Princeton, but also in general, how do you think this is going to flow for the fall for colleges and universities, as well as companies, frankly, reopening?
So I'd like to go back to my point that it's been 5, 6, 7 weeks since this all started.
I love that point, by the way. Thank you for reminding us that it's not been Blur's Day for months or years. It's
exactly. And in order for colleges to reopen, we're going to have really widely available testing that is inexpensive and that is quick, so that you could do a random sample of students in a dorm. So I'm talking largely about residential colleges here. You could do random samples of students in a dorm. If somebody tested positive, you could quickly test their contacts. You're going to have to have widely available testing. You're going to have tracing. I suspect that will involve a combination of in-person contact tracing, and this is my prediction, having had conversations with my daughter who desperately wants to get back to college, that there may be giving up a little bit of privacy and using some digital tracing as well, so just because that's quick. And my daughter, she sits in a big lecture hall. She doesn't necessarily know who she's been sitting next to. So having some digital tracing, from her phone or whatever device. Yeah. And then there's going to have to be some physical distancing. And so they would have to figure out ways to reduce the density on campus. And this is where the residential dorms become a real challenge, is how do you have everybody back and have them in residential dorms? Most universities that I know of with residential systems don't have a lot of excess dorm capacity to make that happen. Yeah. Classrooms, I think, are a little easier to imagine. You can have classes on the weekends and start earlier, or you can spread those out a little bit easier so students can sit apart. I have heard that there are many interesting ideas on the table. You've just mentioned one. There could be having students come back for 2 out of 3 terms or something like that, and those 2 terms would constitute a year. There are things that I think people are putting on the table. So my daughter goes to Harvard. I'm not trying to brag here, but I got the notice about what they're thinking. I interpreted that as the shot across the bow. I thought they were managing expectations, to use a lingo from your business. But critically they said they're making up their mind around July, 2 months from now. Yeah. So I think we will see where we are when that time comes. What I will tell you is, for most colleges, financially, not to open in the fall would be devastating. Yeah. And so they're going to find a way. They are motivated to open if at all possible.
Okay, that's really helpful. All right, and he was saying, this student, that is sad to see so many of his fellow students losing entry-level jobs or internships. And do you have a point of view? How is this blip in Gen Z's job opportunity and loss going to affect them and the businesses who aren't hiring? When will that entry-level job market open again?
Well, I mean, that's related to when will the economy rebound. But yeah. I really do feel for the students that are graduating right now. Those entry-level jobs aren't there at the moment, and I don't expect them to be there in the next at least 2 or 3 months. I think we will slowly start to see them opening up. The literature on graduating into a recession is not pretty. And it suggests that students that graduate into a recession will have persistently low wages for quite some time, if not throughout their career. This is not a typical recession, though. And so what I don't know is, how long will it take for us to get to the other side? So again, I actually don't know that prior literature is so informative. I think that it's important for the students to be working on their resumes, thinking through really what they want to do, and be prepared to go for it. But I do feel for these students, because this is a dreadful time to be looking for that entry-level job. But I'm optimistic that we'll get to the other side of this.
Okay, and there's a bunch more questions that I want to get to, but just since we're talking about young people, and you're a senior editor at the Future of Children, how do you imagine, and I guess it would be speculative, how might this be impacting younger kids who are at home? Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Parents who are overwhelmed and,
Entire talk has been speculative, so there's no reason for this not to fall into the same bucket.
Okay, fair enough.
I study education, and one of the aspects that I worry quite a bit about is the impact on educational attainment and what this is doing to the educational experiences of young people. Online, I know many people have argued online is just as good as in class. The evidence suggests it possibly in very certain circumstances, especially at the higher education level for young people, there are programs that can be quite effective, but oftentimes those are actually integrated into the classroom and not necessarily just at home. So one, the quality of education for everybody, I think this was a stopgap. We had to do this. I'm not begrudging, this is something we needed to do, but let's not kid ourselves. There is and has been an impact on the quality of schooling that our children are getting. Importantly, this is going to exacerbate educational inequalities, because for students who have parents that are home that can help them and help guide them, who have internet, that have the technology, who have parents that in terms of helping them can help interpret what the lessons are, they will be less impacted than those students that don't have nearly those supports, including the online opportunities. So I worry about the impact, and I know that our schooling officials are worried about this as well. There's talk about possibly bringing some students back in the summer for some remedial education, some remedial catch up, opening schools a little earlier. I think Governor Newsom was talking about that in California. So there's some recognition of this, but I worry a bit about and we're more than just a bit, but I do worry that this will exacerbate educational inequalities. Similarly, at the higher education level, who is going to go to school next year? You know, I think a lot of students who might have thought about venturing farther away from home, maybe attending, you know, a more intensive college, will stay closer to home out of the fear and uncertainty and the finances in the family. So this is definitely going to be a shakeup, and that education is an investment in our future. So I'm worried about what that implies for down the road.
All right. Any apparent solutions? What could we do? Is there something we citizens can do for these young people?
Oh, well, I mean, support our local school districts. You know, I think that schools I think they're going to be motivated to work hard. But I will say that as Congress debates what it's going to do next, support for state and local governments will be critical. That states, as I mentioned at the onset, most states, it's well over 40 states, have balanced budget laws. They are not getting the revenue from sales. They're not getting revenue from income, taxes. On the other hand, they're pouring out money in terms of medical expenses.
Hotel rate, all that.
Exactly. So it's a perfect storm, and they're hemorrhaging. And if they have to balance their budget, what will they do? Some of them will raise taxes to some extent, but they're going to have to implement cuts. And where are those cuts? Education, higher education will go first. There will be cuts even at the K through 12 level, cuts in our first responders, our cops, our firefighters. So just in places, and possibly Medicaid. So the people who are most vulnerable, who most need it and who need it most, are going to suffer. And this will have provide headwinds for quite some time. So this wasn't the first thing that the federal government needed to do, because the states had the funds, they had rainy day funds, they could be funding what they were doing. They did get the money to fund the COVID related expenses, but there are many other expenses that they are incurring through this crisis that are not explicitly COVID related. And unless they get the help that they need, this will both prolong the time of the recovery, but also have implications for our educational system.
Yeah, okay, all right. Let's keep going. Let's see, one of our retail members, following up on the supply chain question, many companies sourcing from China had actually already started to shift away because of tariffs. And then that diversification has accelerated now with COVID. What does that mean for the Chinese economy, their role in the world and the relations to the US, et cetera? Do you have a point of view on that? Maybe with your Woodrow Wilson School hat on? I don't know.
I don't know. Right, I mean, China has really developed, and I'm way in speculation here, but they really have developed as a place to do inefficient manufacturing. I mean, inefficient, but inexpensive manufacturing that was, quick and has been the go-to spot. So I think they're going to have to diversify as well, and develop more of a domestic market. for themselves as well. I think that while globalization will remain very important, I think we can see it come down a notch, at least in the short term.
Yeah, it's hard for me. It can't completely go away. There's too many.
Yeah.
It's too deeply connected.
Yeah,
And in fact, it's like a 500-year trend, by the way. It's not like the last 20 years.
No, and that's good, right? We are we're planet Earth. So I think that I don't believe that we should just become islands, but I think that recognizing the fragility of really needing a screw from, 5,000, 10,000 miles away can be a problem.
Yeah. Okay, this is interesting. So we have one of the guests here with us is actually an economics professor at Regis University in Denver. And she said, some economists have predicted current events will lead to further concentration of industry and market power among the largest businesses and all that entails: less competition, higher prices, less innovation. Can you comment? Do you have a point of view on that?
So I have seen that some people have predicted that as well. And I think that would be a shame. I think that some of the inequality that we've been seeing over the last 30 years is coming from this concentration, and not just on the monopoly power in terms of the prices, but in terms of monopsony. This is, again, I'm a labor economist, in terms of they're not paying wages to their workers that are competitive wages. So I do think that this concentration is not good for the rest of us. And so I do hope they're wrong, but if they aren't wrong, then I think it will be incumbent upon us to innovate how we measure concentration and how we think of it, and try to break them up.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Let's see, what else do we have here? This is a member at a financial services company focused on helping consumers with debt. So obviously they're right in the middle of this. They're seeing a lot of consumers with a short-term spike in cash flow as customers receive stimulus and unemployment payments, or let's call it, what do we call, instead of stimulus, shall we call it like protection or
relief or aid? I don't know.
Yeah, and they're also able to defer mortgage and credit card and car payments in many cases. One part of the legislation was if you lost salary, you could defer your mortgage for a year, I think, right? He's asking, they wonder if this help may mask longer term problems when these payments eventually come due and several jobs don't come back. Is this something you're concerned about, i.e. are we just kicking the can further down the road?
So this is something that has sort of in the back of my mind. It's not my first concern right now, because I do think that's a longer term. I think one of the things I would first think about is what's the role of the Fed in this. That I think the Fed is buying up a lot of this credit, and if the Fed just forgives it at some point, then there might not be a reckoning. But I don't know enough about the Federal Reserve's facilities that it's ramping up, but it is really coming into play. And that's where that's the first thing I would think about in terms of what the long-term implications might be.
And I read a number, and again, you're going to be better versed in this than me, but it appears that the Fed's balance sheet is actually now twice what it was in the Great Recession, when we thought that was
oh my gosh, Ben Bernanke, has he gone mad?
Yeah. So there's a lot. The Fed's doing a lot, and that's an interesting point. I suppose you're right. They are buying mortgages. They're buying mortgage-backed securities. They're also buying corporate debt.
Exactly.
I think they have not bought junk bonds yet, but they might. Everything down to just the grade above that, I think the triple Bs. Okay, let's see, what else do we have? So I just want to, could you talk, so first of all, I just want to say again, I love that you reminded us of how short a time frame this is. I love that you said, look, we have moved quickly. I think, it's like every day's a decade in this world that we're in, and we forget this sometimes, that it's only been a few weeks. Holy moly.
It feels like a lifetime, let's be honest.
Yeah, it totally does. I'm actually pretty good at embracing change. I went through as a kid lots of change, not all of it good, but it gave me a certain resiliency. Of course, I've never seen anything like this. None of us have. I don't feel like I'm so good at change now. But could you talk? There was an article today in the Financial Times about Africa. And there was some optimism that, wow, they haven't had that many cases. But then there were some who were saying, wait, don't go there because we're still early on the wave here. This is exponential, and it looks low at first, and then it can really catch you by surprise. But there's also things that I've been concerned about in terms of like, because of the focus on COVID, the anti-malarial efforts have to stop. And that means that 350,000 more Africans will die from malaria this year because malarial nets can't be distributed and health workers can't go into the field and so on. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you know, given this interconnected world we're in, how do you think, what are you aware of in terms of both Africa and Latin America and other parts of Asia, and how should, you know, what should we be aware about what's happening there?
So I don't know a lot about what's happening in different places. I do know that the IMF is trying to very much be there for countries in terms of finances and making funds available.
Yeah.
A friend of mine is a development economist, and she's from India. The one thing she keeps reminding is India managed to get cash transfers to something like 500 million people.
Yes,
like what's up, the US? And so I think a lot of developing countries have, not that they're, you know, perfect, but they do have better systems for the cash transfer part. The other thing that she did remind me of is in a lot of parts of Africa, they have had more immediate experience with infectious diseases, such as Ebola, so that their public health systems are actually better developed probably than what we had in the US. That this idea of isolation, contact tracing, that they have. Yeah. So they have some of those systems in place. You know, I think we all do worry about the medical facilities and just how equipped they are to deal with the worst of it. But they may avoid some of our outcomes from actually the fact that they've had to be living with this for more.
Our guest yesterday, Dan Ariely, I don't know if you've run into him. He's one of the behavioral economists who, you know, predictably irrational and so on. He said, he was talking a lot about the importance of, like, when we start to reopen, that people have, you know, like, you need to think about how you start to create habits of being back out again. And, you know, you mentioned something he talked about, which is how do you help restaurants, you know, get more space outside on the curb or on the sidewalk or something, so that you can start to encourage those habits, because we've had this huge shock. And he said that the literature shows that when you have a shock like this, new habits that form around it, especially related to fear, tend to be stickier. And so this is going to be one of the things. So so one of our members has just written about how New York, where I live, Brooklyn, has 21% antibody positive tests right now. How do we set policy for social distancing when the risk only applies to a shifting portion of the population, assuming those antibody tests are correct, which is also a caveat we have to have around that, right? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I know that was it Brazil or as a country that was going to issue ID cards for those who had
I
tested.
who that was.
Yeah. I don't quite understand how that gets implemented. If I take my own workplace, I need many different people to make the place run, the Woodrow Wilson School. So I couldn't, it's not like we're all substitutable so that I could just take somebody who's antibody positive and somebody who's not.
You have single points of failure, so to speak, in certain roles. Like not everyone can do everyone else's role.
Yeah, exactly. And so I don't know how I can sort of literally usefully use that information. If I was in the healthcare sector, I might be able to use that in terms of who's actually treating patients versus not. But for many other businesses, it's not so clear to me.
Yeah. All right, another question. In the past, this person writes, we've seen recessions lead to a switch in the global power structure. So first of all, that's his point of view, obviously. You know, do you see China taking over as the major global power from the US in the aftermath of this pandemic?
I really don't know. I think there's so many questions on both sides. I think our response has been quite underwhelming. And I think it revealed, you know, for the most advanced country or what's supposed to be the most powerful country in the world, our response to this pandemic has been truly stunning, in my humble opinion. I think we should have done better. I think we could have done better. And I hope we will learn from this so the next time we will do better. At the same time, you know, China is a particular political system. They have their own strategies. It's a little unclear to what extent, I think many people, including people I've heard who know people in China, they were wildly underreporting what was happening in China. So I don't know that we know fully what actually is happening in China.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think it's too early to say.
Yeah. By the way, on the point, it's very interesting. I don't know anything about this organization, but I read a couple days ago that there's a new conservative group called American Compass, which is advocating for strong, effective government. Like that has not been a conservative position for a very, very long time, interestingly. And they're saying that it can't just be defense, because obviously conservatives have said defense spending. So like what this has shown us is that we, for the effective, for our security overall and as our country, we need to rethink this. So I don't know how much that will happen and if there will be some kind of a new consensus that cuts across pre-existing bitterly partisan lines that have hampered so much in the last 10 years. But I was hopeful. I don't know much about them or, how much support they'll gain in that group. But yeah, I thought that was.
Well, look, this is a point that I've been trying to make. I just posted an op-ed that didn't meet anybody's agreement with it on medium.com, I guess. That in economics, in first year economics, we teach the private market, the invisible hand of the private market has many virtues and leads to a very vibrant economy. But there are known market failures. So one of them is for public goods. That's like defense, where if I get defended, I can't stop you from getting defended. Public health is the same way, right?
Yeah.
If you don't get sick, I don't get sick, especially with infectious diseases. So that we have a public good. We've got externalities. So we all understand we need to be subsidizing education because there are positive externalities. When I go to school, I make everybody else better off.
Yeah.
And infectious disease is a negative externality. We need people to stay home when they're infected. Paid sick days make a lot of sense, and we should have that. A health insurance market needs everybody to participate. Otherwise, you get adverse selection, and it can't sustain itself. And yet everybody's going to need healthcare at some point, and it's expensive. Right. So why are we providing that through the private market, relying on the employment relationship as the primary way that people get insurance? Yeah. So I actually, this is my point, is I don't understand why this is a left or right, Republican, Democrat issue. Even if you are somebody who believes in markets, the market can't do everything, and this pandemic is laying all of that.
Yeah,
in great
I've become a bit of and I'm going to emphasize the word amateur scholar on Adam Smith, who turns out to have been a moral philosopher. He didn't consider himself an economist. There wasn't such a thing anyway. And he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and then he wrote The Wealth of Nations. But in both of, you see very clearly, he's not the invisible hand, which he obviously developed and had a big impact. He doesn't think that the market does everything either. Like if you go back to sort of these pillars, they didn't assume that. And they were also responding to a world where the government had controlled everything. Right. Like, the Tudor economy in England have literally said, if you're a farmer, this is exactly how much you can charge another yeoman to work with you. And if you overpay them, you're thrown in jail, right? Like, that's not the world that we're in today. We have, I believe, and I support a very free market. Anyway, okay, so we're here at 3:00 Eastern time. What a pleasure talking to you. I just can't thank you enough for agreeing to do this and coming and sharing your thoughts with this community. My final thought is that, would you be willing, can you share those slides? They didn't seem like they had any proprietary stuff on them. Some of our members would love to look at that. Let me know if that's okay, because it was just so helpful. I mean, we have them within this, but it's just so helpful. And thank you for reminding us of some of the basic things. In our very first conversation, when I said to you, what's the difference between this crisis and 08? They're like, this is not a financial crisis. This is a public health crisis. I'm like, oh yeah, duh. Yeah, thank you. Well, wonderful.
Well, you're very welcome. It's been an absolute delight.
Yeah, thank you. And good luck in figuring out what you're doing in the fall at Princeton and with the Woodrow Wilson School.
Yeah.
And if you come up with any initiatives that more citizens need to support in terms of helping our youth, let me know. I'd love to get the word out. Okay. All right. Thank you. And thank you, everybody. Okay.
Bye.